Hello, AXCon. Welcome to ARIA for the Uninitiated. I know you could have chosen any other of the other wonderful sessions available at this time, so I'm extremely grateful that you chose to be here. If you don't know me, my name is Gerard K. Cohen, and I am the engineering manager for the accessibility experience team at Twitter as of about 2.5 weeks now. And of course, you can reach me on Twitter at Gerard K. Cohen, and you could check out my website at gerardkcohen.me. I'll have this information at the end, just in case you miss it here. The link to the slides are available at https://bit.ly/2 uppercase Z as in zebra, lowercase c, the number 6, capital T as in Tom, capital D as in David, capital F as in Frank. So you can follow along, and I'll share this again at the end just in case, but I'll leave it up here for a few seconds as well. A few shout outs for some of my friends. If you didn't get a chance to check it out earlier today, make sure you catch the replays of From Nothing to Something, how a team of 2 kickstarted an accessibility program by Alexis and a good friend Sima from Splunk, as well as Accidental Advocacy, When You Don't Realize You're Steering the Ship by Andrew Hayward, who's my teammate at Twitter. And later on today, I highly recommend that you catch Micro Interactions, more like Microaggressions by The Shell Little. In all honesty, you can't go wrong with any of the sessions available throughout AXCon, but you definitely don't want to miss those. Lastly, thanks to the fine folks at DQ for allowing me to speak to all of you today, and special thanks to Laura Goslin for putting up with me and all my emails. Wanted to take this opportunity to quickly let you know that I do have some accessibility courses available on the Pluralsight learning platform, which are part of their Developing Websites for Accessibility path. They are Meeting Web Accessibility Guidelines, Introduction to Develop Custom Components with ARIA, and Accessibility, Testing, and Screen Reader Use. So if you're interested in learning more from me, you can check these out over at Pluralsight. This presentation is mostly for new users of ARIA, and I'm basically going to be walking through the documentation and showing a few examples. But even if you've been using ARIA for a while, you might learn a few things. So here's my agenda for today. I'll start off first with a warning about the dangers of ARIA. From there, I'll do an introduction of the official ARIA standard, pointing out important sections, including the 5 rules of ARIA. Another important resource I'll go over is the ARIA authoring practices, and I want to discuss their purpose and proper use. At that point, you should be pretty well introduced to ARIA, so I'll use a practical example of building an expand collapse control to really demonstrate how to use these ARIA resources. And finally, I'll walk through testing of the expand collapse control by discussing the accessibility tree and using a screen reader to test the final result. Now, before I get started, I want to explain why I felt like presenting this content to you today. I personally think that ARIA has a bad rap, and that might be controversial statements to some of you, but I think it's excessively vilified, and I can certainly understand why, and a lot of the negative sentiment is definitely warranted. I will definitely not deny that. It can easily be misunderstood and abused and can do some serious damage to assistive technology users. I think it's just much easier to say don't use it than it is to properly explain it and learn it, but that's not really going to help anyone. At a certain point, HTML alone is not enough. And what I will say is that ARIA should never really be an option, but when it is, I think it's your only option. And just like anything else, it's not perfect by any means, but you shouldn't be overly afraid of it, and you shouldn't avoid it. I recommend that you take the time to learn and understand it. Now, I just thought of something based on some noise in the chat room. Apparently, everyone's betting on how many times I mentioned the first rule of ARIA. So I thought, why don't we make a contest out of it? I'll randomly choose somebody who tweets me at Twitter the number of times that I actually say or speak of the first rule of ARIA throughout this presentation, and I'll send you a prize. I don't know, maybe like an Echo Dot or something. So tweet me at Gerard K. Cohen with the number of times I say, mention the first rule of ARIA, and you'll get a prize. So with that being said, let's go ahead and get started with the dangers of ARIA. So I want to first talk about the dangers of ARIA and why it is important to know and use it right. ARIA is very powerful and essential to providing the level of dynamics available in today's web. Using ARIA incorrectly can cause some barriers for users of assistive technologies. And as I've said already, ARIA should be a last resort, basically a way to fill in the gaps that HTML has. So why is ARIA so troublesome? Well, besides people not taking the time to learn it properly, I'd say one main reason is because ARIA support varies. There are actually a lot of hands in the pot by the time it reaches an assistive technology user. Unfortunately, ARIA is not always completely supported by both browsers and assistive technologies the same way. And with the ARIA that is supported, sometimes there's bugs in the implementation. What's frustrating is that it's different across all browser and assistive technology combinations. One role or property may work great in one combination, but not implemented or function properly in another. Sometimes the implementations may break after originally working properly. It's the same as you would expect with any of the other web technologies. Unfortunately, there are no media queries that you can query for support like CSS, or the ability to test for support with JS to provide a polyfill. The only thing you can do is test your work and provide workarounds, but you have to know what you're doing. Throwing ARIA at a problem is not always the solution. To prove that point, a survey of 1 million homepages by WebAIM in March of 2020 states homepages with ARIA present average 60% more errors than pages without ARIA. So the more that ARIA is used, the more errors were found on the page. So not only is throwing ARIA at a problem not a proper solution, it could be making things worse. This is why there's a very popular sentiment in the community that no ARIA is better than bad ARIA. The point here is that if you don't know how to really use ARIA, it's just better to leave it off. Thankfully, you're here today, and hopefully you'll learn enough to not contribute to making things worse. So finally, let's get into the documentation. The official ARIA standard is the first resource I want to expose to you. Normally, visiting the official standard or spec for any kind of web technology is reserved for the extremely academic types. Most of you have probably never read the official ECMAScript standard, but I want you to treat the official ARIA standard as an API guide to get the most up-to-date information on available properties and options. If you want to know what something means, I urge you to come here first before searching online or reading on some blog. As of this morning, the latest version of the ARIA standard is 1.1. And you can always get to the latest version of the standard by going to www.w3.org/T R/Y, that's WAI-ARIA, ARIA. And make sure you bookmark this. If you want to do ARIA right, you'll reference this a lot. Now, I don't expect you to read the whole thing. Well, actually, I kind of do, but there are a couple of sections that I want to point out to you right now that will serve you as the basis for everything I talk about in this presentation and everything you will do related to ARIA from now on. Incidentally, ARIA 1.2 is getting closer as it was promoted to candidate recommendation last week. But today I'm going to be using version 1.1. This first section I want to point out is section 5.3, which is the categorization of roles. And this section lists the available roles that ARIA provides. So what are roles? Well, roles are how you provide semantics to elements. And as you know, semantics are extremely important to accessibility. Semantics are the way you let someone, an assistive technology user mostly, know what something is, which is also an indicator of how that thing is to be used. For example, if I hand you an object and I tell you that it's a fork, you'll most likely know what it is and how it is to be used. Roles do the same thing, and they're essentially a contract between you and the user. Once you've provided a role on an element, you also have to ensure that the functionality and interaction that that role is meant to provide. Now, the categorization of a role is key. It's a clue as to what the purpose of the role is, and there are four that I want to point out to you. Starting with section 5.3.2 for widget roles. Now, widget roles are the roles that you use to indicate interactive elements, and these interactive elements can be broken down into two groups, standalone and composite. First, standalone widgets either operate on their own or exist to be part of a composite widget. And there are 20 standalone widgets listed here, some of which you may be familiar with, like button, checkbox, or link. The next group are composite widget roles, and these are essentially parent roles or containers for other standalone widget roles. There is a very strict hierarchy when it comes to composite widgets. These have to be composed with very specific standalone roles and often in a very particular order. In most cases, you cannot pick and choose which roles you use to compose a widget, since some standalone roles can only exist as a child or nested in one of these 9 composite widget roles. Now, let me repeat that because this is really important. There are very strict parent-child relationships between certain roles. So some roles can only be used as a child to a specific composite role. This is extremely important to understand, especially with how easy certain UI libraries make it easy to reuse components and render whenever necessary. Be very careful about how you nest components and roles, because you can be breaking your well-intended accessibility if you don't respect the parent-child relationship of roles. I'll go over relationships of roles a little bit later, so let me move on to the next set of roles for document structure. Document structure provides content organization. These 26 document structure roles are in most cases not interactive, but they provide semantics for content like headings, images, lists, and tables. A lot of these are already provided by HTML elements, and I'll talk about more about that redundancy in a little bit later. The next group of roles are live region roles. Live region roles are essentially pieces of content that are updated dynamically and announced by assistive technology, but not necessarily based on direct user interaction. They don't need to be actively focused by a user in order to be announced. Some examples of content that would be considered a good use for live regions are sports scores, chat logs, timers, or dynamic error messaging. Live regions are extremely important and heavily used in today's dynamic web applications, but they can also be abused and overused. I won't go over live regions in this presentation, but at least wanted you to be aware of them anyway. The last group of roles that I want to point out are window roles. And these are, and there are only two of them. Window roles are considered to be dynamic in-window pop-ups, if you will. These could be considered composite widget roles, except that they have special meaning in terms of document structure. Okay, finally, an alphabetical reference of all the available roles is listed in section 5.4, definition of roles. Another important part of the standard you need to be familiar with is under section 6 on supported states and properties. Specifically, section 6.4 on global states and properties, and 6.5, which is the taxonomy of why ARIA states and properties. Section 6.5 lists all available states and properties in categories similar to the role categories. For example, widget attributes and relationship attributes. Section 6.6 is an alphabetical listing of all the available ARIA states and properties. And I'll go over the usage of these states and properties later when I demonstrate how to build an expandable widget. So if you're paying close attention, then maybe you noticed that I skipped over the section on landmark roles. And I did intentionally skip over landmark roles for a very specific reason. Almost all of these roles can be specified using HTML and do not require ARIA. When you have the need to express these role semantics, then you should be using the HTML counterparts instead. So what's the big deal about using them if they're available? Well, that's a great question to ask leading into the next section on the 5 rules of ARIA. So when it comes to ARIA, there are 5 very well-established rules that you need to be aware of. These high-level rules will always guide you in making the right decision when you're developing your own ARIA widgets. The first rule of ARIA might as well be the only rule of ARIA because it's repeated so often. If you have already started on your journey in ARIA, you may have heard this one already. The first rule is don't use ARIA. Now, this may remind you of some sort of Fight Club rule, and ARIA can definitely cause a lot of fights. But if you're confused by this rule, it's because it's not totally accurate. This is actually an incomplete rule. The entire rule is don't use ARIA if you can use HTML instead. The second part is almost always left off, but it's really important. As I mentioned in the overview of the ARIA standard, ARIA is used to describe widget role semantics and state. And a lot of this can be covered by existing HTML elements and properties. And if you can use the HTML counterpart first, and it's supported by browsers and assistive technologies, then you're better off just using the HTML, as it will provide all the same properties as ARIA while providing a more stable experience. For example, Going back to the ARIA landmark roles, as demonstrated here, most of these have HTML tags that you would use instead. So instead of role of banner, you should use the header tag. Instead of role equals complementary, you should use the aside tag. Role equals form is the same as the form tag, and role equals main is the same as the main tag. Role of navigation is the same as the nav tag. Role region is the same as a section tag with an accessible name. And without an accessible name, the section tag itself is not recognized. And we'll talk more about accessible names in a little bit, especially with the fifth rule of ARIA. Now, role equals contact info is the same as the footer tag. And actually, the only one that doesn't have an associated HTML tag is the search landmark. So when these HTML tags were first introduced, it would advise to use both the tag and the ARIA role to be backwards compatible. But now that HTML5 is widely supported, it's no longer necessary. In fact, if you make it a practice to validate your markup, which you absolutely should, you'll get an error telling you not to double up on the semantics this way. You might get the same error if you do any kind of automated accessibility testing, depending on the tool that you use. So the second rule of ARIA is don't change native semantics. If you're being responsible and using HTML first, you have to make sure that you don't use ARIA to replace the semantics that the native element has. You see, when you use an ARIA role, you are explicitly setting the semantics of that element. The ARIA role takes precedence over the HTML. And let me show you an example. Let's say your site or application has a collapsed menu and you're using a link because it's easy to style and it also natively provides focusability, which you heard was good for accessibility. So you provide a click handler event to prevent the default behavior of making the page jump when the link is used, and then you display your menu. At some point, you learn that links are meant for navigation and you should really just use a button for this, but you don't want to have to modify your markup or CSS. You also just learned about ARIA roles and how they provide semantics, so you decided to add the role of button. Now, this menu is communicated as a button and you're happy. If this doesn't make sense to you right now, don't worry. I'll get into what all of this means in a bit. So what is the problem with adding the role in this way? Well, as you may have already learned, roles specify semantics and semantics are a contract. The element needs to behave as expected for the role, but links using the space key, but links don't act the same as buttons. Links are activated using the enter key and buttons are activated using the space key. You've told a user that this is a button and they will try to use the space key, but nothing will happen. You've broken the contract. So to fix this, you decide to add additional JavaScript to restore the contract. And now technically assistive technology users, assistive technology might smooth over the usage of space versus enter, but that really shouldn't change the guidance here. At this point, considering all the work that you had to do, hopefully you realize that it would have been easier to just use a button. If you use HTML as intended, the platform will provide a lot for you, including semantics and interaction. You then use ARIA to fill in the gaps as necessary. Hopefully, the third rule of ARIA should be familiar to you already. Basically, all interactive ARIA roles need to be operable by keyboard. If functionality is provided via a mouse, touch, or any other method of input, it also needs to be available by keyboard. This is important in fulfilling the contract of semantics that keyboard support is absolutely fundamental for accessibility support. Ensuring keyboard support will get you a long way with other input modalities as well, like game controllers, for example. The fourth rule of ARIA is don't use role equals presentation or ARIA hidden equals true on visible focusable elements. The role of presentation is a very special role. It basically removes the semantics of an element. If you do this to an interactive or focusable element, then an assistive technology user will not know what it is for and how to use it. And this could create a very serious barrier. ARIA hidden is a state that effectively hides that element from assistive technology users. ARIA just describes things. It doesn't affect appearance or functionality the way HTML attributes might. When you're using ARIA hidden equals true on an element, it's still rendered and visible on the screen. And doing this on a visible interactive element hides that element, which can, again, create a serious barrier to your users. Proper ways to hide elements is a separate conversation, but for now, just know that role equals presentation and ARIA hidden equals true can be very dangerous if not fully understood and used properly. The fifth and last rule of ARIA is that all interactive elements must have an accessible name. And why is this important? Well, I'm going to use a simple example without ARIA to explain. Imagine you had a form with a few form elements, like this text input here. Without an accessible name or label, all you're telling a user is input. But input for what? What are they inputting? One way, and not necessarily the best way, but one way would be to use the ARIA label property to provide the accessible name. Now a user will know to provide the street address. Again, this is actually not the best way to provide an input label, mainly because it's just not visible, but we're talking about ARIA here. You should definitely use a traditional label tag to provide the label. So if semantics or roles give you the type, then the accessible name tells you what. And not only is it important for screen reader and Braille users, it's also important for voice recognition users to be able to identify and interact with controls on a page. So make sure that all interactive elements have an accessible name. The 5 rules of ARIA are documented here on the W3 site at https://www.w3.org/capital T as in Tom, capital R as in Robert, /ARIA-in-HTML. And you could read up on more information and examples. There's a lot of really good information documented on this page, so I encourage you to check it out and learn more. Another important resource that I want to discuss are the official ARIA authoring practices. This resource is often referred to as an example of proper ARIA implementation for various widgets. The ARIA authoring practices are available at www.w3.org/tr/y-aria-practices. And they demonstrate about 27 different widgets and patterns. Some are essentially ARIA recreations of HTML elements like button and checkbox, but some of them are interactive widgets that are only available via ARIA, like tabs. I'm going to use the accordion example because I actually wrote the sample code for this pattern, so I'm most familiar with it. Now, each pattern starts with some information about the general purpose and usage, which can include variations on the pattern. I'm going to skip over the example right now and go over the keyboard interaction section. Included with each pattern is the expected keyboard interaction, which describes each interactive element with the expected keys to implement and the expected result of activating those keys. For example, with the accordion, when focus is on an accordion header, enter or space should essentially toggle whether or not the accordion is expanded. Expectations for tab and shift tab, as well as optional controls like up or down arrows, and home or end are also included. After the keyboard support section is a section that lists all the necessary ARIA role states and properties for the pattern. Everything you need to know in terms of implementing this pattern is listed here. Now, to experience this in real life, let's go back to the example that is provided. All of the examples follow the same outline. They start off with some links at the top, a brief introduction of the example being demonstrated, and how the pattern is being implemented. I'll get back to these links in a bit. After that is a live working implementation of the pattern that you can play with and test. After the example is usually a description or explanation of various accessibility features that are implemented. While not always specific to ARIA, it's general good guidance to follow. This guidance here explains the focus indication and how it helps to let users know that enhanced keyboard navigation is provided. Following that is the keyboard support that is implemented. And again, this breaks down all the expected keys that are implemented and the expected interactions. And then a more detailed description of the roles, states, and properties and tab index used in the pattern. This is like a mapping of HTML elements to ARIA roles and attributes used in the example. To round out the example are links to the CSS and JavaScript files, and then the markup being used. So Maybe you're thinking about skipping the rest of this presentation and just copying these examples here since everything's done already, right? Well, not so fast. These authoring practices are often used in a way that are not originally intended and often used incorrectly. I want to point out some important notices in the documentation. In the very beginning of this section, I talked about these links at the top, and I want to point out some things mentioned in the browser and assistive technology support page. This is really, really important. The page states, testing assistive technology interoperability is essential for using code from this guide in production. Because the purpose of this guide is to illustrate appropriate use of ARIA 1.1 as defined in the ARIA specification, these design patterns, reference examples, and sample code intentionally do not describe and implement coding techniques for working around problems caused by gaps in support for ARIA 1.1 in browsers and assistive technologies. It is thus advisable to test implementations thoroughly with each browser and assistive technology combination that is relevant within a target audience. It goes on to say, except in cases where the ARIA working group and other contributors have overlooked an error, examples in this guide do not function well in a particular browser or with a specific assistive technology are demonstrating browser or assistive technology bugs. Browser and assistive technology developers can thus utilize code in this guide to help assess the quality of their support for ARIA 1.1. And that is from the ARIA Authoring Practices document, section 2.2, Browser and Assistive Technology Support, with some added emphasis by me. So what does that long quote mean? Well, what this is saying is that they don't provide any guidance as to how to work around bugs in browsers and AT. And these guides provide the state of which they would like things to be supported. It's actually a testing tool basically for browsers and AT vendors to help beef up support if something is not working. The truth of the matter is that ARIA is only a spec. There's no guarantee that browser vendors and assistive technologies are going to support all the roles, states, and properties. Just the same way building codes don't always guarantee that something is built properly into code. Because of this, they advise testing everything before using. One more note I want to point out here. Currently, this guide does not indicate which examples are compatible with mobile browsers or touch interfaces. While some of the examples include specific features that enhance mobile and touch support, some ARIA features are not supported in any mobile browser. In addition, there is not yet a standardized approach for providing touch interactions that work across mobile browsers. And this is from the ARIA Authoring Practices document, section 2.3, Mobile and Touch Support. So this is basically an acknowledgement that these patterns and the ARIA used to build them may not even be supported by mobile browsers. In fact, the design patterns do not even really take mobile and touch into consideration. And this is actually just further work, future work to be done. And I see a lot of component libraries advertise that they're accessible because they implement the ARIA authoring practices, but just be aware that that doesn't always guarantee accessibility. Things need to be tested. So what are you supposed to do? Now, I'm not telling you that you can't use these patterns. You can certainly use them as a basis for your widgets, but you shouldn't use them as is. The point of all this is test, test, test. Everything that you do, and not just on your own, hopefully with real users. You'll discover some inconsistencies, and you'll be expected to fill in those gaps on your own. That's why it's important to know and understand ARIA, and not just copy and paste these patterns. Whew. All right, I just got a time check, and I'm actually, let's see, 40 slides left. Let's see what we can do here. So the authoring practices call this out explicitly in the testing practices and tools section by saying the accessibility of interactive content cannot be confirmed by static checks alone. Developers of interactive content should test for device-independent access to widgets and applications, and should verify accessibility API access to all content and changes during user interaction. And this is from the ARIA Authoring Practices document section 1.5.2, Testing Practices and Tools. So again, just another prompt to make sure that you're actually testing with assistive technologies and not just relying on the inclusion of ARIA to ensure accessibility. Another thing that I want to mention is that since this is basically an ARIA testbed, a lot of times they will deviate from the first rule of ARIA, which is don't use ARIA, and use roles and properties that are perfectly available via HTML. And this isn't a contradiction, but in order to test ARIA, they have to use all of ARIA. Again, I'm not saying that you shouldn't use this resource. I'm just emphasizing that you need to test everything yourself. You should definitely follow the keyboard interaction and start with the roles and properties demonstrated, but experiment with falling back to using HTML first, and then make sure you can test everything with assistive technologies. Now I'm going to build on top of the principles that I have talked about and dive into some code for a typical expandable component. In Bootstrap, this is called collapse, and other UI libraries may call it collapsible. I'm going to call it expandable, and it'll make sense in a bit. So I'm going to start with an example of an FAQ page to see how well it covers the concepts I just went over. Based on the experience, I'll demonstrate the purpose of semantics and how to apply them with ARIA. Here's a typical FAQ page, and there's a list of questions that can be expanded to display the answer. In this case, I'm just using my mouse and clicking on the title here to expand. Now let me try the same FAQ with my screen reader, but I'm going to dim the screen so that you can get an idea of what the screen reader might go through.
Voiceover on Safari, frequently asked questions visited link, skip to main content. You are currently on main. You are currently on a heading level 1. Link, GitHub, list 3 items. You are link, Twitter. You are link, GitHub.
First thing, tabbing seems to skip right over the FAQs. And this is the first sign that things have not been implemented properly. Luckily, screen reader users have other ways to navigate a page. In this case, I can use the arrow keys to navigate.
You are heading level 1, frequently asked questions. You are currently on a heading level 1. Heading level 2, where can I find the ARIA spec? You are currently
okay, so I found a heading that is formatted as a question. Let me see what happens when I use the space key. Nothing. How about the enter key? Okay, nothing. Space and enter are keys that you would almost commonly use to perform a click action, but they don't seem to be working. So obviously something is wrong here. And an assistive technology user may not be able to get the answers to their questions. So bringing the screen back, let me talk about what happened here. First of all, this FAQ is not keyboard operable. I'm tabbing through the page, and as experienced with the screen reader, I'm just not able to get to the FAQs. This means that even without an assistive technology running, a keyboard-only user wouldn't be able to access any of the answers. And this is breaking the third rule of ARIA and a few WCAG guidelines. Using my screen reader, at least I was able to find something, but there was no indication of what to do. Sure, the heading was formatted as a question, but when I tried to perform the click action, nothing actually happened. So hopefully you all know that semantics are huge for accessibility. So what exactly are semantics? I've talked about them a couple times already, but semantics basically express what something is. And once you know what something is, then you know how to use it. And what is expected, what is the respected result from using that thing? Semantics play a very big part in an important concept when it comes to accessibility of interactive widgets. Basically, every interactive control must provide the following 3 things: name, role, and value. Of these 3 things, semantic provides the role. And this is where we really get into ARIA. The ARIA 1.1 standard provides 70 usable roles. Incidentally, in ARIA 1.2, there are 12 new roles added for a total of 82 usable roles. Most of these roles are for document structure and are added mostly to bring ARIA in line with existing HTML. So now there are roles for block quote, strong, paragraph, and even a role called generic, which is described as a nameless container element that has no semantic meaning on its own. So basically, it sounds like it's an ARIA role for divs. In any case, adding ARIA roles to mimic HTML seems unnecessary considering the first rule of ARIA, which is don't use ARIA. But if you've been in the unfortunate situation of having to fix things without being able to change the markup, then you can appreciate these additions. So these 70 roles in version 1.1, only 29 of them are interactive widget roles. In 1.2, there are no new interactive roles added. So let's go back to the official ARIA standard and see what we can find. So here is once again the official ARIA standard, and I'm back at section 5.3.2 for widget roles. And there are 29 available widget roles. These are the only roles that are available in ARIA. You cannot make up your own. I repeat, you cannot make up your own roles. So looking at these 29 roles, you can select any one of them to get more details. And I'm going to take a look at the first one, the button role. Each role provides a definition and information on usage. A button is defined as an input that allows for user-triggered actions when clicked or pressed. And it sounds exactly what I need. So let me go back to the code, and I'm going to add this role. So here's the existing code with the FAQ title as a heading level 2. I'm just going to add the role equals button to the H2, and now I'm going to test this.
Where can I find the ARIA Spec button?
Navigating to the first FAQ, it announces as a button, which is great. Now I'm giving users an indication of what this is, and I know what it is. As a button, I can use space or enter to get to the answer, but it doesn't work. Now, this is an important lesson in ARIA and semantics. Roles don't provide interaction. They simply just describe what something is, but don't provide the expected behavior. And as mentioned before, semantics are a contract with the user. Once you tell someone what something is, they'll know how to use it, and you need to honor that contract. You need to provide the expected interaction. So even though I added the role of button, this thing is still not complete. Not only that, by doing this, I have effectively broken the first 3 roles of ARIA. As a review, the first rule of ARIA is not to use ARIA when you can use HTML instead. And even though there's a role of button, it's better in this case to use an actual HTML button. The second rule of ARIA we broke as well by putting the role of button on the H2. We effectively replaced the H2 semantics with the role of button. And then the third rule of ARIA that we broke was that the FAQs themselves weren't accessible by keyboard. We can throw a lot of code at this, like adding a tab index of 0 to make it focusable, and then listen for key down events for enter or space, and that would complete the button. But I'm about to show you a very quick fix here with very little impact to the JavaScript. All I'm going to do is wrap the H2 with a button and then move the FAQ title class over to that button. And that's it. It's a small change with a huge impact. So let's test this and see how it works. Now I can access each one of the tabs. Now I can access each one of the FAQs by tab. And how about that contract? So I've expanded the FAQ using space and enter key, and it works. I didn't even have to touch the JavaScript. Whew. So HTML can provide semantics, focusability, and interaction simply by using the right HTML element. And this is why accessibility professionals stress learning HTML so much. It does a lot of the heavy lifting for you. I know it's a lot easier than it sounds since there's a lot of HTML elements to choose from, and it can be hard to know when to use HTML versus ARIA. So I'm currently working on a periodic table of semantics. This periodic table of semantics lists every HTML element available, and it matches it to an ARIA role. So if you need to provide semantics, you can easily find out if there's an HTML element you can use, and if not, you can fill in the gap using ARIA. You can find this periodic table of semantics at http://bit.ly/2 uppercase I, uppercase M as in Mary, uppercase K as in King, the number 1, lowercase k, and lowercase o. Going back to the FAQ control, maybe you're not impressed because technically I'm not using any ARIA. This is a presentation ARIA, but for the goal of this exercise, providing semantics, we don't need ARIA yet. And this is meeting the first rule of ARIA. Don't use ARIA when you could use HTML instead. ARIA should only be used when necessary to fill in gaps when necessary. And there's a gap here that we need to fill. Obviously, interacting with the button produces a change on the screen. It expands and collapses the answer. Since the main focus of accessibility is to provide the same experience to all users, I need to express this change to assistive technology users. To do that, I need to use some ARIA states. We got about 10 minutes left. I have a few more slides left, so if you don't mind, let me get through these real quick. Thank you. Thank you so much. Along with providing semantics by way of roles, ARIA also provides states and properties to further describe interfaces to assistive technologies. And in this section, we're going to learn more about them and apply them to IFRQ. Going back to the 3 things that all interactive controls need, name, role, and value, ARIA states and properties help provide name, role, and value. And this is extremely important to accessibility because dynamic changes must be presented programmatically. And this is what ARIA states and properties help provide. As of ARIA 1.1, there are a total of 48 states and properties. So let's take a look at the available states, these 48 available states and properties. Back to the official ARIA standard at section 6.6, which is the definition of states and properties. There are 48 that are available, and just like the roles, you cannot make up your own states and properties. Along with not being able to make up your own, there are rules about which states and properties can be applied to specific roles. Some states and properties are required on certain roles, and some states and properties are not supported or allowed on other roles. So considering there's a large set of options and a limited way to set and apply them, how do you figure out the right one to use? Well, we can check back to the role definition to find out. Each role definition includes this table of characteristics, and here are supported states and properties. There are 2 states and properties that are allowed on the button role, one of which is the ARIA expanded. And that sounds pretty interesting, so I'm going to select it to get more information. So ARIA expanded is described by as indicating whether the element or another grouping element in controls is currently expanded or collapsed. Just like roles, each state and property definition includes a table of characteristics. And here's the roles used in roles section, where you see all the roles that this particular state supply. As confirmation, I see that the button is listed. Also included are the values that are accepted by this ARIA expanded property. So I'm going to update the markup and simply just add ARIA expanded false on the button. And I need to update the JavaScript to toggle this state between true or false. And I won't actually go over the JavaScript. You can use whatever you want. It doesn't really matter. The important thing is that the markup is rendered in the browser. And that is what your users and assistive technologies interact with. So whether you're using jQuery or React, it doesn't matter. The markup has to be right. So now the ARIA expanded state will let assistive technology users know that this content can be expanded and collapsed. And this is perfect. We have a proper role, proper interaction, and we are communicating the state change. We can actually see all of this by inspecting the accessibility tree. The accessibility tree is a subset of the DOM tree. And these days, it's very easy to inspect the accessibility tree in browsers. I'm going to run through this real quick, but using Chrome as an example, I'm going to inspect one of my new FAQ buttons. And in the inspector, I'm going to open the accessibility panel and check out the accessibility tree information. You can look at the computed properties section to get a summary of everything. And I get the name of where can I find the ARIA spec. And this is a role of button and also the ARIA expanded state. And here it's listed as collapsed. But if I expand it, then it changes to true. And most browsers offer a way to inspect the accessibility tree. But that's not enough. You have to make sure you test with an assistive technology. And even though the accessibility tree offers a quick way to test for accessibility, as I mentioned many times before, you should really test with some kind of assistive technology. I'm going to dim the screen and run through our fixed FAQ page with voiceover again, so that we can hear the difference in the experience.
Voiceover on Safari. Frequently asked questions. Where can I find the ARIA spec? Collapse button.
So again, I'm just going to tab down to the FAQs and get the name of the role.
The ARIA spec is located at.
And it's announced as a button and lets me know that it's currently collapsed. And the fact that this control is announced and collapsed lets a user know that there will be additional information if it's expanded. So I'll expand the FAQ and you'll get to hear the information. All right, so this is a successful implementation. In the end, all it took was correct HTML for semantics and one ARIA property. Knowing ARIA and using the docs on top of knowing HTML, I was able to provide the necessary experience without abusing ARIA. Sometimes you don't need too much ARIA, but in other more complex cases, you may need to go full ARIA. So in summary, don't be afraid of ARIA, familiarize with the specs, learn how to use them properly, and use only when it's needed to fill in the HTML gaps. Mastering ARIA is not just about how to use it, but more importantly, when not to use it. And no matter what you do, make sure you test everything. With that, I apologize for having to rush through the end, but I want to thank you for attending. I hope you feel more comfortable about ARIA. Again, the slides are at http://bit.ly/2 Z, capital Z, lowercase c, 6, capital T, capital D, lowercase f. And if you have any questions or comments or feedback, you can reach me at Gerard K. Cohen at Twitter. Don't forget about the contest. Please tweet me. Let me know how many times I mentioned the first rule of ARIA. I'm done. Now for questions.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Well, just a couple questions here.
All right. Thank you.
Yeah, I think we have about 5 minutes or so. So I will go with the ones that did receive the most upvotes. Tons of questions. Thank you so much, Gerard. Okay, so when you are using ARIA Live to update dynamic content, how do you deal when you have multiple updates on a page that needs to be announced? For example, changing your age on a form updates your monthly premium and duration of term. And then in parentheses, it says above your focus point on 2 separate areas within your page.
Okay, so you're changing a field and there's some dynamic information that's being updated above or below. So I'll just answer both ways. So if it's below, if it's below, technically you don't really have to, you don't have to use the live region to announce them. They're just kind of in the flow of the document. If it's above, maybe a design change, but you really should prioritize, the updates that are happening. Maybe combine them so that there's one, one announcement, but definitely you need to be careful with updating too much, because you got to keep in mind also that those announcements will interrupt or try to sneak in while the user is also typing. So it can be very chatty. So if you can, make a design change to have that information lower, or maybe there's a review page that can happen, that would be my recommendation. So rather than trying to fix it on the ARIA level, you could fix it at a design level, which would be better.
Gotcha. Awesome. Okay, when would you want to use ARIA hidden equals true?
There's actually some good cases for that. And let's see. Sometimes for example, when providing, when using, so I'll use ARIA hidden equals true for SVGs, really to provide the to provide alt text for SVGs. I'll hide the SVG and just provide the alt text as text that's rendered on the page. So that's one way to use it.
Got it. Okay, let's try and squeeze in at least one more question here. What tools do you recommend for validating the semantics of HTML?
Oh, that's a good question. So you can always, the W3C has a validator. I think it's nu.validator.org. You could search a new NU validator, and that will give you an ability to either upload or paste in code. There's some Node plugins that you can use, and I believe Axcon actually does. I'm sorry, not Axcon. I've been saying that too much. I believe Ax will the automated testing tool also does the validation as well.
Ax DevTools. Yep, awesome.
Yeah.
Okay, one last question here. Can you give an example of how an AT user can suffer from bad usage of ARIA?
Oh, again, so not providing the right semantics. I use an example of adding a roll of button to something that was H2. Abuse of live regions is very prevalent. So too many things being announced at the same time, it's hard to listen to that. Hiding content when it's not supposed to be hidden is another one.
Got it. Awesome. Well, I do apologize for any questions or all of the questions that we weren't able to get to. Everybody was very engaged. No, Gerard, this was great. Thank you so much for your time and for this great content. Thank you everybody for attending this session. We have a handful more left in AxCon, so I hope you all enjoy the rest of it. Thank you so much.
Have a great one. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks. Bye.